This is episode number 150 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest today is Dr. Luca Trenta. Luca is an associate professor in international relations at Swansea University in Wales and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Higher Education Academy. He's written extensively on the subjects of covert action and assassination as tools of foreign policy. He is the host of the Out of the Shadows podcast with 8 episodes available now, and he has appeared on 4 episodes of the Secret Wars Uncovered series on the History Channel. I invited Luca onto the podcast today to discuss his book, The President's Kill List, which was just published on May 31st, 2024. It's a thorough history of U.S. government involvement in the assassination of foreign officials from the early Cold War through the present day. These operations, both successful and unsuccessful, have played a major role in American foreign policy and world affairs on many occasions. By the way, if you're looking for a way to get friends and family as interested in history as you are, or if you want to learn something new and unexpected every month, then make sure to check out History by Mail. Every month, History by Mail will send you reproductions of famous and influential historical documents from American history. Accompanying the documents themselves are articles which put them in the context of their times and help you understand the impact they had on the course of American life. The topics are widely varied, so you're always learning something new across themes that include historic inventions, American wars, and foreign diplomatic relations. I'm really enjoying my own subscription because it's opened my eyes to historic events I knew nothing about. You can subscribe for yourself or gift a subscription at historybymail.com for as little as $6.50 a month. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code JUSTIN10 for a permanent 10% off your subscription. Luca, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I've covered some of these operations that are discussed in your book here on the podcast in the past, but I thought that what you wrote was just incredibly well researched, and I learned a lot about those same ones that I've already looked into myself. I thought I was very familiar with these subjects, but it turns out there was still a lot left for you to uncover.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Absolutely. So can you tell me why you chose this as the subject of your next book?
I guess it's primarily for two main reasons. One, I've always had sort of an interest in the CIA and the U.S. government and its foreign policy. Even when I was back in Italy as an undergrad, I still remember one of the first books I bought in English was Legacy of Ashes, which was a history of the CIA by Tim Weiner. But then more recently, when I was finishing off my PhD, it was the time of the Obama administration, and there was clearly a peak in the use of targeted killings and drone strikes. And you will recall that at one point, several officials of the Obama administration went on a sort of public relations spree, and they started giving various speeches on national security, justifying the use of drones and targeted killings. And what they kept repeating was that targeted killings was perfectly legal. It was not assassination, because assassination within the US government is prohibited by executive order. And so that got me interested in how did this executive order come about, and how did we manage to get to a stage where the US government can kill individuals for political or strategic reasons, while at the same time claiming that these are not assassinations because assassinations are prohibited. Mm-hmm. And so I started writing a couple of articles on the topic, and eventually I thought, well, why not write a broader book to look at the role of assassination in US foreign policy more broadly.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm also really glad to hear you mention Legacy of Ashes, by the way. That was a real gateway book for me as well. I think it came out like 2006, 2007, something like that. And yeah, I read it cover to cover, and that was definitely one of the catalysts for where I'm at today, honestly.
And I guess I think also for me being Italian, one of the first major operations conducted by the CIA is the electoral interference in Italy in 1948.
Yeah. yeah, I think it was Angleton was there during the war, and then he had a huge influence afterwards. I remember that specifically from that book as well, yeah. Fascinating. Since we're talking just about the aftermath of World War II and operations starting out, that's a perfect segue, honestly. Right in the foreword, the first couple of chapters of your book, they clearly very aggressively pursued some of these assassinations and targeted killings right after the war ended. The late 40s, early 50s. I mean, they were full steam ahead with a lot of this. Why do you think that is? Why did they pursue that strategy so aggressively in the early days of the agency?
I think there are a couple of reasons here, and one always has to be careful because there is always a degree of sort of self-justification if one reads interviews of US officials released in later decades. One of the reasons is definitely that there was a lot of continuity, both in terms of personnel and in terms of practices between the OSS and, in particular, Stanley Lovell's outfit within the OSS, which was focused on research and development, and the early CIA. There was a lot of continuity in personnel, in approaches, in ideas, and so on. The second element is definitely, and here is where one could think that is pure self-justification, but I think there is an element of truth. There was a serious concern, especially in the late 40s and early 50s, regarding the capabilities of the Soviet Union. There had been some concern already in the 1930s during the purges about sort of Soviet ability to do what would later become known as brainwashing prisoners. But when the Korean War came and you had famous testimonies by American prisoners of war admitting that they'd done things that in reality they might not have done, or wanting to defect to the Soviet Union, there was a serious concern that the Soviet Union had developed certain capabilities to do something with the mind, I guess. And more broadly, there was a certain Cold War paranoia about the capabilities and the manpower that the Soviet Union had, even if those would largely prove unfounded. What I found particularly interesting is that in the early Cold War, assassination is understood more as a regular contingency. It's something that the CIA and US officials would consider as available. And there are several early CIA officials that see themselves as a sort of the first line of defense uh, against the Soviet Union, in the battle against the Soviet Union. And so, of course, if you are the first line of defense in what is a battle for the soul of mankind, of course, you would consider that plenty of methods are available, even controversial ones.
Absolutely. Would this include? I think it was it Frank Wisner, I believe, was kind of one of the leaders of this. Am I recalling that correctly? With the Office of Policy Coordination
Yeah,
back in
yeah.
the early days. Okay, yeah.
An outfit called PB7, Program
Mm-hmm.
Branch 7, which was under Boris Pash, who actually has a short
Yeah.
appearance in the recent blockbuster Oppenheimer, because he was also involved in the security for the Manhattan Project. And it seems that this was a branch in the early CIA which had a charter that permitted or assigned to PB7 the task of conducting assassination if required.
Okay. Okay. I see. I see. And since you mentioned the brainwashing, I did an earlier episode about the Korean POWs who decided to stay in Korea and then later in China as well. And it really was amazing how the idea of brainwashing really took hold with the American populace. So, was it specifically that led CIA to start experimenting with hypnosis and other kind of what we would call pseudosciences now?
Yeah, I think that certainly played a part, and of course, in somewhat later years, he also had a major pop cultural influence with first the book and eventually the movie about the Manchurian Candidate, which
Hmm.
again was based on this idea of brainwashing prisoners of war. But the CIA had started quite early with experiments, especially with hypnosis and drugs. The code name would change over time. Initially, it was Bluebird, I believe. Then it became Artichoke, which is really the bulk of hypnosis experiments related to assassination. And then, of course, it would become MK Ultra, which is sort of controversial for a whole series of reasons that go well beyond potential involvement in assassination, I guess.
Right, right, right. I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think Ultra was sort of like an umbrella concept with many, many different separate like lines of inquiry and lines of experimentation, that sort of thing. Underneath it, it was just not one single
Yeah, absolutely.
strategy.
Yeah. MK Ultra became an umbrella term for, I think, more than 50 underlying projects. And even the earlier codename Artichoke included
Hmm.
both experiments regarding interrogation in various sites in the United States and in Europe. And it also included experiments with hypnosis and the posing of allegedly hypothetical problems to what were called artichoke teams as to whether they could get an individual to do something that it would not normally do.
Hmm. Yeah, I was very surprised by that because I was aware that it had occurred, but your book goes into a great amount of detail about it. They were hypnotizing the CIA secretaries and causing them to do things that they most definitely would not normally do. Can you talk a little bit about how far that got and whether or not it was a like a dry hole or what exactly?
Yeah, I think there were unofficial games with hypnosis and more official programs. The unofficial games came primarily from Morse Allen, who was a member of the CIA. And this is recounted in a book about brainwashing as well. He tended to hypnotize his own secretaries and either convince one that she had to shoot another secretary if she wouldn't wake up, even leaving a pistol there for her to shoot. Of course, the gun was not loaded, or convince a secretary to bring a package to another room, which in theory could be some sort of explosive and so on. And alongside these, there were experiments conducted by artichoke teams. One is posed as an hypothetical problem, but explicitly mentioned using an asset to assassinate the official of a foreign government. And there is even the mention of the official of the US government, although there is an asterisk that says that this is hypothetical. Hypothetical or not, the Artichoke team had spotted a potential candidate to carry this out. But as far as we know, they concluded that such an experiment, such a real life activity was not feasible. And here, I guess, one has to exercise some sort of caution because an enormous amount of these documents were destroyed over the years. So we actually know very little of what was potentially going on at the time. What has survived is probably only a small percentage of what was going on, of the experiments that were being carried out, and so on.
Yeah, that's unfortunate that none of that exists now, just purely from a historical perspective. But I do kind of understand that the stigma that this left behind, even the small fraction that exists. So, do you think that most of this ended due to practical concerns, like it just was not feasible, or was it more like legal and moral and ethical concerns, like hey, we should not be going down this path?
Again, based on what we have, I think the concerns were primarily operational. There was a
Hmm.
concern that while this could work very much in a sort of artificial and protected environment, like an office with secretaries, it would not actually work in real life. There weren't, as far as I could find, in all honesty, that many ethical concerns. This was a time in which covert operations were seen as a perfectly fine instrument, and the very famous Doolittle report also invited the US government to convince the American people that repugnant methods had to be adopted because the Soviet Union was doing the same thing. And in all honesty, I don't think there were any legal concerns surrounding these type of operations, although in certain cases, certain of these experiments were carried out abroad to avoid sort of domestic illegalities.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Understandable, and sort of a legacy there as well, as I'm sure we'll get into a little bit. So, did all of this stuff, Luca? Did it have to go all the way up to the president, the actual targeted killings? You mentioned the Obama administration a few minutes ago, which was many years in the future, of course. But were there people, at the like the mid level program managers that were approving this kind of stuff, or was it actually going up to Eisenhower, Truman, whoever was in the office at the time?
There isn't any evidence that I could find available on Truman on very very early plots. Some of them seem to appear quite organically. For example, I talk about a couple of examples in the first chapter of the book about Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese nationalists. I'm probably butchering the Chinese pronunciation there. And there it seems that they emerged in the field and they were shut down once they reached either the White House or at least the CIA headquarters. But in other cases, I think we have fairly solid evidence that presidents, especially Eisenhower and Kennedy, were quite directly involved and aware that assassination was being carried out and that at times that it was being directed by the CIA. I talk about in the chapter on Lumumba, for example, we have fairly strong recollections by people who were present that Eisenhower gave an order to assassinate Lumumba. In the case of Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, again, you have what comes very close to an order by Eisenhower and definitely awareness by Kennedy and
Hmm.
people very close to Kennedy, say Richard Goodwin, for example, that assassination was very much on the cards. And of course, there is a very extensive debate that enters into wide conspiracy theories when it comes to Castro, the CIA, and the mafia. But in the book, I kind of reached the conclusion that it requires sort of a suspension of disbelief to think that the Kennedy brothers knew nothing about assassination attempts against Castro.
Yeah, I would certainly have a hard time believing that as well, no question about it. So, Luca, your book covers so many different anecdotes, and some of those are already familiar to my listeners, from previous episodes, like you did mention Lumumba a minute ago. And we just did an episode about the plot against Lumumba a couple of months ago, so not that long ago at all. So, I want to talk to you about South Vietnam, and it was President No Dien Diem, I believe. Can you talk about his removal from power? Because the U.S. was, I don't know if I'd say had a direct hand, but they were certainly well aware, and they were certainly had up to the minute updates as that went down. So can you talk about what happened there exactly? Like, we initially supported him, but then we moved him out.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an interesting case, precisely because, like in the case of Trujillo, somebody who had been an ally of the United States for a certain period of time eventually gets removed and from power and killed. The United States government had supported Diem in an effort to establish control of South Vietnam. Initially, that even accepted the cancellation of elections that had been promised at the Geneva conference and had provided extensive economic, military, political support. Edward Lansdale would famously try to help Diem in strengthening his control. So it started to change, I guess, in the early 1960s, 62, 63. Plenty of US officials started to become somewhat, I guess, disgruntled or frustrated by three main elements. One, the corruption of the South Vietnamese government and the increased distance or detachment between the sort of ruling clique of Diem and his brother Nu and their families and the rest of the population, basically, primarily because the ruling clique was Catholic, whereas the majority of the population was Buddhist. And this created all sorts of tensions that would sort of end up causing plenty of protest from Buddhists and the repression from the regime. The second issue was economic. It seems that plenty of US officials, particularly in the State Department, were trying to exercise pressure on Diem for economic reforms and land reforms, and these were not forthcoming. And finally, it seemed that Diem and his brother were not taking the US advice regarding how to conduct the war against the North and against the guerrilla supported by the North. So I think this sort of started to turn the tide. And then there is an episode, I think, in February of 62, when sort of two disgruntled South Vietnamese army pilots conduct a bombing raid of the presidential palace. And from that moment, the CIA sort of becomes, I guess, much more aware that there is some unhappiness, there is something going on. And this becomes even more prominent in July, when there is a 4th of July party organized at the US Embassy, basically attended by most South Vietnamese generals. And there you have both the US ambassador and the CIA starting to talk to the generals and gather that there is something sort of brewing among the generals.
Hmm. Okay. Okay, I see. So, do you think that at this point, or at any point, I should say, did the U.S. government, up to the presidential administration, did they specifically want Jim to be killed, or did they simply want someone else in power, and how he was removed was less important?
I think initially they wanted to detach Diem from his brother Nu's wife and Nu's approach to the war and the military. The military was quite scared of the regime and of criticizing the regime. So initially, the objective of the United States was, if at all possible, to sort of separate the two brothers,
Hmm.
make sure that Nu no longer had military or political power. Pretty quickly, this appears to be unlikely or unworkable. And so the argument starts to become that maybe a covert regime change is necessary. And there is a famous cable on the 24th of October, 63, in which the argument is made that basically the US government is happy to green light a coup if Diem cannot get rid of Nu or if the government is not changing his policies. And it is from this moment onwards, basically, that the US government becomes more heavily involved. But it is always clear, I think, that what the US want is to get Diem and all his clique out. What happens to them isn't particularly a concern. And in a conversation between John Kennedy and the president, Henry Cabot Lodge, who Kennedy has just named ambassador to Vietnam, there is an explicit discussion about the risk of assassination of the two brothers. And Kennedy sort of seems to accept that this might happen and that this is something that the US has to accept. And there are plenty of telegrams going to the White House in later weeks reminding the president that basically once the US goes down the path of regime change, what happens to Diem is out of the US hands, basically.
Okay. Okay, I see. So once they do go down this path, as you just mentioned, does that come in the form of like monetary support or weapons or just like political influence or something else entirely?
Compared to other cases that I explore in the book, this doesn't necessarily come in the forms of military support, primarily because these are generals of the South Vietnamese army, and so they have sort of all the weapons they need to carry out what they want to do. It does happen in the form of political support and also hand-holding, for lack of a better term, by CIA officials of the generals. Lucien Conain is very much involved with the generals, is the main contact. He is the one who spends the day of the coup at the general's headquarters. He is the one who convinces them not to stop once the coup encounters initial difficulties. And there is a transfer of money to buy the loyalty of certain troops in Saigon, and later on to provide for the families of those who had been wounded or killed in the coup. So there is a financial element, but I think more broadly is the political support provided to the generals, and there is the creation of what I call a system of incentives. So the incentives and sanctions, really, the generals are told that if they are successful, they will continue to receive US economic and military support. But if they are unsuccessful, the US will stop this type of support. But in this system, there is never a moment in which the safety or the survival, if not the safety, the survival of Diem is mentioned. And even at the very last minute, when the generals asked the United States for a plane to take the brothers to safety, whether they wanted to do so or not, I think is beside the point. Basically, the United States and the CIA refused to provide one with a whole series of excuses, even if there were some available.
I see. I see. A lot of subtle moves there to push it towards his demise in the end, I take it.
Yeah.
I see. So, since you mentioned the coup, can you talk about kind of like moment by moment how that actually occurred?
Basically, I guess the generals are able to take control of Saigon fairly quickly. This had actually been discussed with the CIA at one point, how best to proceed. They're able to take control of Saigon. Quite a few troops surrender. One in charge of sort of special forces and very close to Diem surrenders and is even involved in calling Diem, asking him to surrender, and then is shot by the generals at their headquarters. At one point, Diem and his brother Nu find refuge initially seemed to find refuge in the presidential palace. And there is a whole series of telephone conversations between the generals and the two brothers asking Diem to surrender, to come out and surrender. Diem refuses. And at one point, basically, Big Min, who is the general in charge, loses his patience and decides first to bomb the presidential palace and then to travel to the presidential palace to get Diem. But once he gets there, it turns out that Diem is not actually in the palace. It would come out that he had found refuge in the house of a supporter of the regime whose telephone lines were connected into the palace to give the impression that Diem had not left the palace. Eventually, this is discovered, and it turns out that the two brothers are in a church. So a new set of cars is sent to pick them up. And here there are different interpretations. According to Max Hastings, Min gives an order to his bodyguard, a signal to his bodyguard that the two have to be shot. And they are shot in the back of a truck that was taking them back allegedly to the general's headquarters.
Okay, I see. So it happened kind of out of view of anyone except for the occupants of that vehicle,
Yes,
basically.
and
I see.
also the degree of knowledge, how far the degree of knowledge went beyond the generals is up for debate. Initially,
Hmm.
Lucien Conein had said that he had to go home because they were preparing for a press conference for the peaceful transition of power. But then he admitted that was never actually a thing.
Mm.
And something that I found quite interesting in some personal collections, some personal papers of a scholar of US foreign policy, is that in later years, one of the generals involved stated that actually there had been a vote among the generals and it had been decided that Diem had to be killed. Even Conain in later years admitted that he knew that. And the generals, I think, feared that if Diem had survived and he had been taken prisoner, basically the United States might in the future change its mind, or the South Vietnamese people might have changed their mind and wanted Diem back, and they then would have been in trouble.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I can understand that as a very valid concern. Both of those are very valid concerns. So, look, you mentioned how disgruntled they were with the pilots dropping bombs and the generals, kind of already commiserating together. Do you think that this coup would have occurred no matter what, without, or in some form or another, without the U.S. doing the hand holding as you described it, or was this primarily like a U.S. sort of initiative that made this occur?
It's difficult to say. My personal view is that it would not have happened without the
Hmm.
United States. But there is an extensive debate about this. I think Harry Cabot Lodge, who was the ambassador and very much one of the leading figures behind the US role in the coup, told Kennedy in its aftermath that the seed of the coup was already there, but only thanks to the United States there was such a fertile ground
Hmm.
for the seed to grow into a very robust plant. I think that's a way of putting it. But I think at various points, the generals ask a series of very concerned questions to the US that give the impression that if the US had said no, the coup would not have gone ahead,
Hmm.
especially since there had been an earlier coup attempt in August that had fizzled out precisely because the US government had not given to the generals all the guarantees that they wanted.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, no way really to talk about alternate history events with any real confidence, but yeah, it definitely makes sense that we kind of, you know, pushed this or initiated this sort of chain reaction that led to this, even if it was entirely the South Vietnamese that were taking action on the day of, so to speak. But yeah, I can see how we were not just the unseen hand, but the seen hand behind
Yeah,
behind
yeah.
everything there. Okay, I see. And I think most everybody's pretty familiar with what happened in Vietnam from 1963 on at this point, for better or worse. So, Luca, I would also like to move forward then to Chile, which I've done an episode about recently, but I did not talk about this, or we did not discuss this General Schneider at all. I was moderately familiar with his story from the past, but once again, there was quite a bit of detail there that I was not aware of already. So, can you talk about General Schneider in Chile around the early 1970s and why it was that we decided he needed to go?
General René Schneider was the commander in chief of the Chilean Army, and he had become a staunch supporter of a constitutional role for the army, in a sense that the army should not interfere in the electoral process, should stay out of politics, and should actually act as a sort of guarantor of Chilean democracy. This, of course, was a view that was not shared by many within the Chilean army, and it was certainly not shared by the United States, which had a fairly long history of electoral and political interference in Chile, as well as extensive financial and political
Hmm.
support for the Chilean military.
Okay. Okay, I've got it. We were heavily involved in Chilean politics, as I, recently kind of covered a little bit. This plot initially was to kidnap him, which I was not really expecting. That seems just like something that can go wrong in so many ways, as I know that we're going to get into. But why was there a plot to kidnap him initially, at least, as opposed to kind of killing him or discrediting him or, having him fired from the army or whatever have you?
I guess a caveat here is that the plot was to kidnap him, but from the start, there was a clear sense that kidnapping was likely to lead to bloodshed. And the CIA chief of station at the time was certainly to go ahead anyway, or it did not express any opposition to this idea. I think initially the plan was to try and convince then Chilean President Eduardo Frei to give Schneider a role in the cabinet so that it could be, in inverted commas, neutralized in a more political manner, so that he could be taken out of his military role and put in the cabinet. When this proved unfeasible, and when, as I go to quite some length in the book to discuss, other para-constitutional efforts to prevent the confirmation of Allende as president by the Chilean Congress, as they fall by the wayside, the idea is basically that Schneider could be kidnapped because the kidnapping can then be blamed on Allende supporters and leftists. While he is, I guess, kidnapped, the military could take advantage of this situation to take control of the country, of politics of the country. And then in this scenario, Schneider would be presented with a sort of fait accompli. He would have no option but to accept what the military had done.
Oh, wow. Well, that's some real brinksmanship there. I'm impressed, honestly, if that had been what occurred. But as you mentioned, this kidnapping was kind of always going to lead to bloodshed. So, how much was the U.S. involved in this kidnapping? I take it that the CIA was knowledgeable and facilitated to a certain extent, at least for the kidnapping plot to move forward.
Yeah, the CIA was knowledgeable. The DIA was involved in the transfer of weapons to the military. The CIA was also heavily involved with paramilitary right-wing groups, Patria y Libertad, whose members, together with right-wing students, were part of the plot to kidnap Schneider. Edward Corey, the US ambassador to Chile, was certainly involved in corruption efforts and para-constitutional methods, although he expressed strong opposition to the use of Patria Libertad and other sort of terroristic outfits. But the CIA did talk extensively to the generals involved. And I think in this case, we have a very solid record of the extent to which the US government as a whole really put a lot of pressure on the Chilean military to prevent initially Allende's election, but when that failed, Allende's confirmation as president.
I see. One thing that I was very surprised about in your book was you mentioned that there were a couple of guys that I would kind of use the euphemism troubleshooters were sent. American troubleshooters were sent. Sforza and McMaster went down there, kind of a couple of specialists to help move this plot forward. Is that unusual for us to kind of send, like American citizens to become directly involved in this sort of thing?
I don't think it's particularly unusual. I mean, this is a discovery that should be credited to Peter Kornblue, who's done some exceptional work on Chile, and he calls these individuals false flaggers. So they were able to present themselves as non-Americans while at the same time working for the CIA to give an additional layer of deniability and contact perhaps military and paramilitary personnel that US officials would not be, I guess, wise to contact directly. So it was an effort to keep in touch with the people that were needed, adding an additional layer of deniability. The United States has done this quite often, I think, with both US citizens and non-US citizens. A chapter that did not make it in the book, for example, is The Hunt for Che Guevara in Bolivia. And there, the United States used 2 Cuban exiles who had been involved in trying to kill Fidel Castro as their point men in the Bolivian army, in training the Bolivian army, and eventually in taking the final pictures of Che Guevara after he was captured.
Yeah, it really is amazing. And not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but those Cuban exiles that you mentioned, they popped up everywhere. I mean, just everywhere for a 30+ year period. Anywhere there was any activity to be conducted, there were some of those guys ready, willing, and able. No question about it.
Oh, absolutely, yes. They would crop up even in later years during the Contras and Nicaragua and so on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the kidnapping plot that we mentioned, what was the actual intent? They were just going to take him somewhere and hold him until they could kind of secure the military. As you mentioned, was this like a weeks long or a months long hostage taking that was planned?
To be honest, it's unclear. There is an interesting document with a reduction just before Kidnapping, basically it says the plan is to redact or kidnap General Schneider. And one is left to wonder what's underneath there. When the plan is fully spelled out, is an enormous amount of steps, and it's sort of at points it beggars belief. In full, the plan is that Schneider is kidnapped by one group. Another group led by General Camilo Valenzuela, who is in charge of the troops, the Santiago garrison, basically the troops in the capital. He is supposed to go on the record to allegedly discover boxes of weapons from Allende's supporters. This is likely to increase support for the military or to create chaos that would permit the military to step in. All of these creates an enormous amount of opportunities for violence, and everybody involved seems to understand that they would find violence absolutely acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. What you mentioned about the one word redaction there, it's funny how sometimes that redaction does not meet the intent to like fully obscure what was going on in a particular document. We should redact or kidnap General Schneider. That is funny. And not the first time that sort of thing has happened, of course, and I'm sure it won't be the last either.
No, but what is quite interesting is that the first two attempts at kidnapping Schneider go horribly wrong. He is supposed to be kidnapped as he's leaving a party, but it takes his own personal car instead of his official car. The second time he's supposed to be kidnapped, but the kidnappers remain stuck in traffic. And all throughout this time, you have memos from CIA headquarters asking the people in the field, so is this kidnapping happening? Because we are under a bit of pressure here from higher authority and so on. And eventually, when it does happen, there is a letter from headquarters congratulating the people in the field for having done everything possible to prevent Allende from coming to power, and that everything is now in the hands of the Chilean people. But I guess the more political aspect of the post-kidnapping kind of falls apart.
Okay, I see. And so it was the third attempt that actually kind of occurred at least, but he did not survive the kidnapping attempt.
No, he did not survive. He is tried to defend himself by shooting some of the kidnappers, and he is shot in return. Initially, it seems that he's shot by machine guns, which were the weapons that the CIA had provided to the kidnappers. But eventually, the conclusion is reached that he was shot with other type of weapons, but that the machine guns were on the scene of the kidnapping.
Okay, I see. So there's a presence there, an American presence there in a very real sense.
Yeah.
I looked around at this a few weeks ago, and the only thing I saw really was like a photo of his vehicle, and like the rear windshield is shattered, but that was about all the photographic evidence I could find, at least in my hour or two of looking around. So
there is very little, and also there are very few pictures of Schneider himself. Even Googling, you always come up with the same 2-3 pictures.
Okay, so it's not just me then.
No,
That's good to know.
No.
Yeah, there are a lot of things I look into, and I'm not able to present as much as I would like to about it, but that's kind of the nature of trying to document espionage history for everybody, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Certainly. Okay, so the ultimate political situation, the kidnapping did not accomplish any of its objectives, or some of its objectives at least were accomplished, would you say?
No, I think actually the kidnapping and what turned out to be the killing or an assassination was actually counterproductive, because the two main groups of plotting generals ended up separating. One was arrested. The other one initially called for a media curfew to prevent, I guess, any awareness of his role leaking out. But you have a massive popular expression of support for Allende. And so instead of creating disarray, this creates support for Allende. And even within the military, at least initially, there is a support for a return to a more apolitical role. So for the military to stay out of politics, which was the position that Schneider had represented.
I see. My gosh. Okay, so mixed results with all of these cases that we're discussing today, and the ones in your book as well, of course.
Yeah.
So it was not long after this at all that U.S. government involvement in these foreign assassinations really came to the forefront of the American public's knowledge anyway. So can you talk about how all of this sort of started to come to light in the early to mid 70s?
Yes, absolutely. It's quite interesting because already in the 60s, you had a few newspaper articles that clearly pointed to the role of the CIA and the US government in assassination. There is certainly one on Trujillo, a few on Fidel Castro by Pearson and Jack Anderson. But they had not created such a public thunderstorm. They had created perhaps an internal thunderstorm to the extent that the CIA established an inspector general to investigate in the CIA an assassination. And now those reports are available, if somewhat redacted. But I guess in the mid 70s, we are in a sort of almost post Vietnam, certainly post Watergate political environment. And so this is a very different attitude that Congress, the media, and the public have towards government and the CIA. And the story really comes out in December of 74 when Seymour Hersh publishes a front page story about the CIA having conducted a massive surveillance campaign against anti-war movements and students and US citizens. This was based on Seymour Hersh somehow getting hold of some material from what is known as the family jewels, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. What is interesting, though, is that in Hersh's story and in the initial media scandals, there was actually no discussion of assassination. Assassination enters the picture, as far as we know, due to a slip of the tongue of President Gerald Ford. The first measure taken by Ford to respond to the investigation is to establish a presidential commission of inquiry chaired by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. It is clear from the composition of the commission, the mandate, and so on, that the objective is not really to sort of find the truth. It's more about giving the impression of taking these allegations seriously, but mostly covering up the whole thing. And at one point, Ford has a lunch with, I think, the editors of the New York Times, and they're chatting, and one of them tells Ford, sort of, how can we possibly trust the Rockefeller Commission to find out the truth when most of the members, all of the members of the commissions are so conservatives? And basically, Ford replies, well, if I had more liberal members of the committee, sort of other stuff would come out. And of course, hearing that, every good journalist would ask, like, what other stuff? And Ford basically says, well, like assassinations. And immediately says, oh, but this is off the record, which of course was not on the cards.
Yeah.
And in fairness, it does kind of remain off the records, but in between, I think it eventually gets to Seymour Hersh, who gives the story to Daniel Shore, another investigative journalist at the time. And Shore calls up CIA Director William Colby and basically poses the question, has the CIA ever killed anybody? And Colby is taken aback because, of course, he had been already involved in quite a few scandals. The Phoenix program comes to mind, I guess. And he replies, not in this country, which, again, is a terrible answer to give to an investigative journalist. Because, of course, Shore starts thinking, okay, who are we talking about? Lumumba. He mentions Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General. But basically, that's the story, and that's how assassination becomes part of what is known as the season of inquiry. And the other reason why it becomes a particular object of congressional investigation is because the Rockefeller Commission, due to the role of its director of staff, David Bailyn, had finally convinced the White House to let the commission investigate assassinations. They had conducted two investigations, particularly on Fidel Castro and Rafael Trujillo. But when the report is completed, Nelson Rockefeller, the commission chair, tells the media, the report is ready, it will be published, and so on. But before it's published, it gets sent to the White House for review. And in the White House, Dick Cheney not only completely changes the language of the report to make it look like the CIA had done nothing wrong, but also completely deletes the chapter that had investigated assassination. So the draft of the report that goes into the White House is 20 chapters. The published report that comes out is 19. And there is even a lie at the start that says that the commission had been given the task of investigating assassination, but it did not have time. So this creates even more of an accusation that this is all a cover-up. And the whole thing is taken up by the Congressional committee that in the meantime have been established. And it's taken up particularly by the committee in the Senate, which is more famously known as the Church Committee.
Sure. So that incredibly public, I don't know if I call it scandal, public circus almost is the term that I would use. And I'm still kind of stunned at some of the things that were said and demonstrated on camera, really, because I mean, people are still talking about that, 50 years later, essentially. But I know that for the most part, that put a huge damper on all of those projects. But as you mentioned, with the Obama administration and targeted killings, after the fallout from the Church Committee, how did the CIA, how did the U.S. government kind of realign to where they could still attempt to target some of these like very, very troublesome people overseas?
So I guess there are two things that come out. I mean, there are many things that come out of the Church Committee and its investigations.
Oh yeah.
It's an enormous investigation.
Hmm.
But for, I guess, the remit of my book, there are two important things that come out. One, which also builds on the Hughes-Ryan amendment that had been passed just before, is the idea of the presidential finding. For any new covert operation, the president has to submit a document in which he states that he finds that such a covert operation is important for US national security. And so this creates a whole new language of covert operations. The second thing to come out of the Church Committee is that in its interim report on assassination, the committee had recommended the establishment of a statute or a law that would explicitly prohibit assassination. And they had provided a whole set of criteria for what activities would amount to assassination, who could not be targeted, and so on. But the Ford administration basically is very adept at preventing any congressional legislation in the realm of intelligence. And they publish an executive order that reforms the intelligence community. And this executive order also contains what becomes known as the ban on assassination. So a line that says that the US government is prohibited from conducting assassination.
Hmm.
But in comparison with the proposal that had been made by the Church Committee, the ban included in the executive order is incredibly vague. It doesn't say what assassination entails, who can be targeted, when, how, and so on. And so in the book, I argue that this ambiguity starts to be exploited, certainly in the Reagan years, which sets a lot of political and legal precedents. And it continues to be exploited by later administrations to bring us to a situation in which, after 9/11, of course, targeted killings almost become institutional policy of the US
Hmm.
government.
Hmm. Absolutely. Luca, do you think that the ambiguity that you mentioned in the law was that very much intentional, or was it just kind of a poorly thought out writing at that time? I'm certainly leaning toward intentional, but I would love to hear what you think.
The ambiguity in the executive order was certainly intentional. We have clear statements by both Ford and Kissinger, who is National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the time, that assassination should be something that is available to the president, that there should be
Hmm.
no instruments that curtail the president options in the realm of covert operations. And I think this is the argument that I'm trying to make in the book. A lot of the scholarship out there basically makes the argument that assassination was something that the US government did sort of in the early Cold War against Fidel Castro and so on. But with the 1970s, assassination is something that is completely prohibited. The US government completely stops, only to restart after 9/11. In the book, I try to make the argument that this is not actually the case. What happens is a change in the way in which the US government carries out these operations and in the way in which it talks about these operations, because it can never be seen as explicitly or intentionally trying to assassinate someone.
Hmm. Okay, yeah, that's exactly what I was expecting. So I would like to fast forward then basically through the 80s, which you certainly talk about quite a bit in the book, but I want to move over to the end of the 80s and the very early 1990s with Saddam Hussein and the Bush administration. So can you talk a little bit about what occurred that put Saddam specifically as a leader in our gun sights, so to speak? I mean, after the invasion of Kuwait, in 1990, why did we pursue a strategy of taking him out directly, and how did they get around that so-called ban on assassination?
I guess immediately after the invasion of Kuwait, according to Sean Naylor, who is an investigative journalist that has traced the history of JSOC, Joint Special Operation Command is immediately involved in drawing up plans to assassinate Saddam. The idea is that if we can get rid of Saddam quickly, the war will end in a quicker fashion,
Hmm.
perhaps. And the same reasoning is also behind the early bombing campaign in the war, which targets basically every place in which the US government thought Saddam might be. And we know this because US officials have admitted to do so. Brent Scowcroft, who was National Security Advisor at the time, did admit that the administration deliberately set out to kill him if we possibly could, which again is very much an admission that they were trying to assassinate Saddam. Of course, this did not happen, and Saddam survived the Gulf War and this first confrontation. And so, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, the H.W. Bush administration tries to move towards options that might help the US government in removing Saddam covertly. The idea, I think, for the H.W. Bush administration is always for someone very close to Saddam or for someone like Saddam to remove him, to kill him. The argument is often one of a palace coup or a silver bullet coup. You have plenty of officials in the H.W. Bush administration admitting that they want to change the ruler and not the regime. So they would be happy with another military dictator, I guess, perhaps somebody more pliant towards US interests.
Understandable. I'm surprised that they thought that sort of the entire infrastructure of the government could be. How do I put this? I guess I'm just surprised that they thought that Saddam was really the only obstacle to an improvement in relations, or at least in dealing with Iraq. But if that's the case, then it certainly makes sense that they would want someone very close to him to simply shoot him one day and be done with it. So, was there any forward progress made in sort of like turning or recruiting a senior member of the Iraqi government, to our knowledge?
Uprising in various provinces in Iraq. And at one point, the Saddam Hussein regime looks very much in trouble. But a whole series of developments, both on the ground and I guess a lack of enthusiasm for the whole plan in Washington, makes it so that Saddam is actually able to present himself as the defender of the Sunni minority, and so it's able to remain in power. The reason was that in the uprising, pro-Iranian groups had actually taken the lead in leading the uprising, which had actually scared some of the Sunni minority of which Saddam was part. But both towards the end of the H.W. Bush administration and in the Clinton years, you have a series of contacts between the CIA, which at one point has a presence in northern Iraq, and Iraqi military, and eventually groups of the Iraqi opposition, the Iraqi National Congress, and also the Iraqi National Accord. Both of them try to carry out coups against Saddam. To make a long story short, is that they both fail. One, because it was hopeless and the United States was unwilling to support it because it considered it the equivalent of a Bay of Pigs invasion. And the other one fails simply because it is so penetrated by Saddam Hussein and his men that all the people that could have been involved in the coup are arrested and killed even before the coup starts.
Yeah. These dictators are very good at understanding that there is always a level of danger in their position, and they seem to be very good at figuring out who is going to rise up against them time and time again, no matter how much effort we try to put into fostering groups and creating a level of secrecy and all that. It does not seem to work out that often.
No, and the situation in Iraq is particularly problematic because you have rivalries within the Iraqi opposition that are Ahmad Chalabi, who would become famous, or I guess infamous in later years post 9/11, is very, very good at selling his views in Washington, but he is not actually particularly well respected within the Iraqi opposition. So there are political issues there. There is overreach at one point by CIA officials on the ground. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And Saddam's intelligence and the strength of his regime seems to be pretty solid.
Yeah, I recall one brief anecdote from that chapter of your book that was quite sad, honestly. And I'm forgetting his name right now. One of the Iraqi generals. He had three sons who were serving in the army, three grown sons, and they were all captured in the coup attempt. Do you recall his name right now?
No, that's a
Yeah,
very
I
good
have it somewhere,
question.
but yeah.
But I'm really sorry. I should recall. But this is part of the Iraqi National Accord plot, which Britain is also involved in. And it combines this general who promised that through his sons, who were then in a prominent position in the Republican Guards, he would be able to gather support and so on. And at the same time, you would have external support coming from Jordan and plenty of books, plenty of propaganda, leaflets, and so on that would
Mm-hmm.
convince the Iraqi military to rise up. But it's something that doesn't actually happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another failed attempt there. And I recall that the general received a call from one of his sons after the failed attempt that basically said that we've all been captured and we're about to be killed,
Yeah,
and that was
yeah.
it. So he lost all three of his sons in a single day, maybe a single hour there, honestly, as
Yeah, Muhammad Shawani was the brigadier
yeah, yeah.
general who had
Mhm.
sons in the Republican Guards. Yeah.
Yeah, what a that's a bitter pill to swallow, no question about it. Involving your sons like that, knowing that they and you are all facing that level of danger, and then it goes terribly awry from your plans, and losing them all like that has got to be horrible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, but it's also interesting, I think, to see some of the continuities in personnel between these plots and later US policy in Iraq, both with Chalabi and with Alawi, who was involved in the Iraqi National Accord plot. He would
Hmm.
show up again around 2003 and post
Yeah,
2003 Iraq.
yeah. He was a big figure many years after that. This was not the end of his story by any means in Iraq. I believe, has he passed away now? I think he has. I looked him up the other day after I finished your book. But yeah, he was involved for a long time after the 2003 invasion.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know that excuse me, the no-fly zone that we were enforcing in Iraq all throughout the 90s. Kind of, were there ever other attempts after the war ended to get him with a U.S. bombing campaign, or was that truly just limited to Desert Storm and then later on to Operation Iraqi Freedom?
No, there was a bombing campaign under the Clinton administration, which, as I argue in the book, was both covered targets that were clearly associated with Saddam in a repeat of the first bombing
Hmm.
of the Gulf War, and was justified as one of the precedents established under the Reagan administration as a bombing of command and control centers. So this is
Hmm.
how the administration sort of circumvented the prohibition on assassination. We're not targeting Saddam personally. We're targeting sort of his command and control centers, his centers of gravity. This goes back to the Reagan bombing of Libya, Operation El Dorado Canyon in 1986. The two are actually fairly similar. So that we now know that Operation Desert Fox was incredibly effective at stopping any Iraqi WMD program, which of course got lost in the sort of partisanship post 9/11 and
Hmm.
so on. But of course, it did not get Saddam. According to Seymour Hersh, a story by Seymour Hersh, which of course, I guess at times one has to take with, shall we say, more than a pinch of salt. The bombing also included the homes of mistresses of Saddam because US intelligence had identified them as places where Saddam could be on that particular night.
Hmm.
Whether this is true or not, it is true that leadership targets were bombed. It is true that at the same time of the bombing, plenty of leaflets were dropped trying to again convince the Iraqi army to rise up against the Republican Guards and the regime. So again, going back to the H.W. Bush administration and this idea of creating some sort of coup environment in which somebody would take care of Saddam.
Hmm. Hmm. No doubt about it. And they certainly seem to be stretching the definition of command and control center when you're talking about an 8-hour period at a woman's home,
Yeah,
because Saddam is
yeah.
spending the night there. I don't know if there's really a command and control center otherwise, except that the guy that you're trying to kill happens to be there at this moment.
In later years, when the same justification would be used against bin Laden and Al Qaeda, one US official would say that in the case of terrorist group, the command and control infrastructure is at times human,
Hmm.
which I guess is
Yeah, yeah. Still not an assassination though. Everybody,
no,
don't
no,
don't worry
no,
about it.
no,
Yeah,
no.
we would never do that. Okay, fascinating. So this is a fantastic book. As I mentioned, I really enjoyed reading it, Luca. For the listeners out there, the book is called The President's Kill List by Luca Trenta, and it has been out since May 31st, 2024. We've only covered 3 or 4 of the stories from the book, but I believe is it 13 chapters?
Actually, 11
Yes,
chapters.
a lot more to read. Some of them you might have heard from me before, but I guarantee you that we did not cover everything as Luca has in this book, because he has been working on this for quite some time. So you're certainly going to learn a lot about these stories, even if you think that you might have heard them before, which was the case for me. Are you working on another book, or do you have another project in mind now that this one is coming out finally?
I am co-editing with a colleague from the University of Texas at Austin a book on state-sponsored assassinations in international politics.
Oh,
We
okay.
look both at issues in state-sponsored assassinations and the approach adopted by various countries, including United States, Iran, Israel, and others. And they
Okay.
should be out sometimes in, I'm assuming, very late 2025 with Linda Reiner. Just to say, since the price of the book is quite steep, your listeners can also get a 30% discount with the code NEW30.
Oh, wow. New 30? Is that
Yeah.
correct? NEW 30?
NEW and 30, the number. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Yeah, I will definitely put that in the show notes as well.
The Edinburgh University Press website is where they can use the code.
Okay. All right, great. We will link it up in that case. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it, Luca. Is there anywhere that people can kind of connect with you online? Do you have website or social media profiles, anything like that?
They can reach me on the Swansea University website via email, or I am on Twitter or X at Luca Trenta. Yeah, that's where they can reach me at.
Okay, great. I'm not even sure if I'm following you yet on Twitter because we've just been going through email so far. I'll have to look and see if I'm following you or not, but I certainly will after this. And I'm glad to hear a lot more about Iranian plots as well because I guess you could say, almost stumbled across a few of those recently. And they are very, very active on the world stage as well. And they love using proxies, including the Hells Angels motorcycle club,
Yeah,
which I
the
just talked
motorcycle
about
club. Yeah,
recently. Yeah, yeah. So a lot of fantastic stuff, or no, I shouldn't say fantastic, a lot of fascinating stuff going on with Iran and Israel, as always, and many other places as well. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So please keep me in the loop as when that will be published.
absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Luca. This has been a great talk, and I look forward to another one day in the future.
Thank you. This was great.
All right. Thank you. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.